Done.
All right, great. All right, so I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to introduce the topic of today's webinar and our speakers. So my name is Leah Ward. I have been with Sppf for 12 wonderful years, and my current role is Director of Communications. I'm joined by Spiro, Senior Director for Global Marketing Communications at Finca Impact Finance. Also, Emily Sims, Senior Specialist for the International Labor Organization, ILO. And Matteo Marinelli, CEO of Maha Agriculture, which is a financial institution in Myanmar. In a few minutes, each of our speakers are going to introduce themselves and their organizations, but first I'd like to quickly set the stage for today's discussion. For Sppf, this topic of maintaining a healthy and productive workforce during COVID is really important because social responsibility to employees is one of the 6 dimensions of the universal standards. Very quickly, in case you're not yet familiar with the standards, these universal standards are standards for social performance management for financial institutions, which simply means that they're standards for how to manage a financial institution so that it achieves both social and financial objectives. And we call them universal because they were co-created by literally hundreds of people in the financial inclusion space. And we did that to make sure that they're truly applicable to any financial institution that has social objectives. Dimension 5 of the Universal Standards is called Treat Employees Responsibly. And as you can see on the slide, there are 3 standards for this dimension, each of which has multiple essential practices and a lot more detail. I will not go into that today, but I wanted you to see this so you could see that these are standards that really describe how a financial institution should treat employees fairly and respectfully when it comes to things like working conditions, salary, incentives, job training, and much more. So I encourage you to look at the universal standards if you haven't already, and I am going to paste into the chat box the hyperlink that will take you to our universal standards page. And if human resources is your main area of interest, you can navigate to Dimension 5. I'll also say that we really believe, like most people, that COVID-19 is going to fundamentally change the microfinance industry, even after the health-related crisis has passed. So Sppf at some point in the future is also going to be updating the employment-related standards here, so that we can reflect new practices that are emerging. So that's the background for why Sppf has a special interest in how employees are affected by COVID. And we wanted to have this discussion today because we know that this is an especially tricky time for employers. And there's no rule book for how to handle a global pandemic when it comes to your employees. We have seen a really wide variety of policies and reactions toward employees, many of which are really creative and resourceful, and most of what we've seen is pro-employee. So in today's discussion, we're going to share some great examples of workforce management from different parts of the world, and we want to hear your ideas as well. I think that no one on this call would pretend to have this topic totally figured out. So you can consider this to be a safe space to share ideas of what's working and what's not working, what questions you have, and we'll learn together. And Sppf will continue to work on this topic in the coming months as well. So we'll have more information for you. All right, so let's jump into introductions and get going with the content. So I've asked Seth and Emily and Matteo to introduce themselves and give a very brief, like 2 or 3 minute introduction to their organization and, if applicable, the state of COVID in their country of operation. So, Seth, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. And you can hear me well?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Seth Spiro. I'm the Senior Director for Marketing and Communications for Finca Impact Finance. I've been at Finca for 6 years as of last week. And we are a network of microfinance banks and institutions that span 20 countries. We have about 2.6 million customers. 12 of our institutions are licensed banks. I myself am responsible for digital marketing, which includes client acquisition and retention, brand management, PR, corporate communications, as well as internal communications. We span 10 time zones, and we have varying degrees right now of affecting our operations from the COVID-19 perspective. In countries like Jordan, they were under a very strict curfew and all operations stopped up until this week. And then in some of our other countries, like Malawi, the full impact of COVID-19 hasn't quite been realized. And so they're continuing their operations somewhat right now, having not felt the full effects of what COVID-19 is surely to bring. And that is an update for me. That's who I am.
Thanks, Seth. All right. Emily, would you introduce yourself next, please?
Sure. Thank you, Leah, and thank you to everyone for participating. I'm very excited to be here. I have to start with a confession. I actually am not a microfinance specialist. It's my colleague, Patricia, who is extremely knowledgeable in this field, along with specialized team, but she asked me to participate today, and we very kindly agreed to my participation because although I don't work with microfinance institutions, I work with companies in general who are trying to improve their own operations and how they try and ensure respect for their workers' rights, but also in their supply chains as well. So I come from that background. I work at the ILO, which for those of you who are not familiar with the ILO, it's the International Labour Organization. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations that supports governments to develop policies and programs for decent work at the global and national levels. It works with governments, but also employers and workers organizations, because the approach is that in tripartite dialogue, with a very full and rich exchange of ideas and developing buy-in, you get the strongest and most effective policies and programs. I am a human rights lawyer and an economist, is my background. But what I do for a living at the ILO is I manage the help desk for business. And what the help desk does is it answers questions from companies seeking to integrate principles of international labor standards into their daily business operations, including their supply chain management. And we do this trying to be true to the principles contained in international labor standards, which are international law, but also in a way that is trying to optimize the efficiency of those enterprises, because one of the fundamental principles for the ILO is respect for workers' rights does not need to and should not come at the cost of the enterprise. The trick is finding the right way to integrate full respect for workers' rights in a way that actually maintains and ideally strengthens those institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for your confession. But it's going to be great to have your perspective on this topic. So glad you're able to join us. Okay, so last but never least, Matteo, could you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Leah and Laura and Sppf family for having Maha on today's webinar. I've been in Myanmar since 2013. I'm the CEO of Maha Agriculture Microfinance since 2017, and I've been in the sector for about 20 years. Myanmar has been in a lockdown phase since April 1st. The lockdown is still ongoing until May 15th. There are already curfews in place throughout the country. Where I'm based in Yangon, Myanmar, we have a curfew that starts at 10 p.m. every night until 4 a.m. Buses are not allowed to circulate. The airport has been closed. Myself and my team, we've been working from home since March 19th. And Maha Agriculture is a microfinance company. It's a 7-year-old company. We have 2 shareholders. Our majority shareholder is Myanmar Koba Group, a Burmese conglomerate specialized in agriculture. And our minority shareholder is IFC, the International Finance Corporation, the private arm of the World Bank. Maha predominantly works and serves smallholder farmers throughout our network of 32 branches. We are a nationwide player. And since our DNA is rural, we are very close to the pain points of our farmers. And we look forward to our discussion together with Seth, Emily, and yourself, Leah. Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. I did not realize that Maha is only 7 years old. That's a surprise because you've really established yourself in such a short amount of time. So that's quite impressive. So thank you for that, those introductions. It's wonderful to have you here, Seth and Emily and Matteo. So rather than asking our speakers to make presentations, today's discussion is going to be interview style. And I have listed our questions here on this slide to make it easier for everyone in the audience to follow along in the conversation. So let me start off with my first question, and this is really addressed to all of our speakers. Let's talk about what are employees' primary concerns right now, and what are employers' primary concerns right now related to their workforce. Emily, would you start off with your thoughts?
Sure. Well, as far as employees are concerned, again, I'm looking a little bit more generally rather than specific to microfinance, although I must confess again, I spent the weekend reading up on what exactly microfinance institutions do and how they tend to operate. It seems like it varies from country to country quite a bit. But nonetheless, hopefully some of these more general, broader issues are also resonating with what you're finding with your staff. As far as employees are concerned, now that most countries are in lockdown, the immediate stress of actually physical survival, the fears of actually getting infection, COVID-19, are quite real, but have been obviously tamped down somewhat with public health measures that have been taken. But the flip side of that is tremendous anxiety through the roof now for everyone around job loss, or if you're lucky that you don't lose your job, you may still lose income because of reduced hours of work, or pay cuts that have been imposed, et cetera, retaining links to coworkers and clients, especially for microfinance people, especially your lending officers or client customer relationship managers who are probably much more gregarious by nature, just by the kind of work that they do, and suddenly finding themselves in relative isolation, even if they're virtually linked, can be quite a shock for a lot of workers. So I imagine that's a big issue for employees as well in your area of work. But also for those of us now working from home across all sorts of sectors, the adaptation of working from home, and I'm talking not just about suddenly having to try and type while your child is sitting in your lap, or competing interests, family, work-life balance, etc. But it's also just working from home is rather strange. The days and nights get more blended together and so forth. And for a lot of workers, it can be quite disorienting and a little bit alienating. So those are some of the key issues that employees are dealing with, especially assuming that they still have employment. Obviously, those who have lost their jobs are dealing with a whole separate set of financial stresses. On the employer side, the main thing that employers obviously have in the forefront of their mind is staying solvent. If they can't stay solvent, then they can't help their workers. And now when you have your clients who are no longer able to service your loans, and it's difficult or impossible to secure new clients with new income streams, it's getting tougher and tougher for MFIs to actually stay afloat unless they have cash injections from the government. The challenge, though, is that you don't want to stay solvent at the expense of losing your staff, because it's not just a personal commitment that management has made to their workers and the relationships you've built over the years, but also their deep level of skills and the excellent client relationships and networks that they have that are so vital to the entire microfinance way of operating. So those are not replaceable very quickly. So the challenge of staying solvent while trying to retain your skilled workers is difficult for MFIs. But it's also getting the supporting staff to get through this crisis together. This is such strange terrain for everyone. And so helping workers in a way that management usually is not called upon, to be there for them emotionally, for emotional support, for mental health check-ins, which are somewhat of an HR responsibility in the workplace, but a much less so because the workplace and the family and home life were more delineated. Now they're all mixed together. And so there's a bit of an expanded role for HR in this strange period that we're going through. But on the other side, it's it's not making lemonade out of lemons, because these are awfully large lemons we're looking at. But at the same time, you do sense, and hopefully this is the case for you as well, in your microfinance institutions, making the most out of a bad situation, and how a lot of this maintaining skills and expanding their skills base, the use of technology and workarounds around productivity and other sorts of innovations that people are coming up with that are giving a sort of positive injection that will help, as Leah said, these MFIs moving forward to be able to address the changing world that we're going to be facing, not just in the next 3-6 months, but in the next 10, 15, 20 years. It's not going to look the same as it was. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. When you mentioned having a toddler in your lap while trying to type, I felt very seen. So thank you for that. But I think too, the people on this call who are HR managers or involved in HR in some way are probably nodding their head when you say that, HR professionals are having to play a new and expanded role. Worrying about their employees' mental health, for example, is something that, is there in normal times, but it is so much more magnified right now. So thank you for that perspective. Matteo, would you agree, disagree? What are you seeing at Maha in terms of your concerns about employees and employees' concerns during this crisis?
Thank you, Leah. Interesting, absolutely interesting talking points raised by Emily. Before we dive into that, allow me to share some statistics on where we are in Myanmar. We, thank God, as of today, do not have a huge number of cases that we see in other regions or geographies, for example, Europe or the US or UK. Right now in Myanmar, we only have 161 confirmed cases. 43 people have recovered. We have, unfortunately, 6 deaths. Over 3,200 people are currently under laboratory investigation to see whether they're positive or not. And as I was saying before, we have been, Maha head office team has been working from home since March 19, and we have about 50 people in our head office. Whereas our over 200 people located in our branches have been split into 2 groups. We are rotating these 2 groups every 28 days. The first group is the group that has been assigned to serve customers, for example, during the month of April. And the second group of branch staff is working from home, helping the first group with ad hoc initiatives and tasks. We have formed at Maha a central committee, COVID-19, with different people from the head office in charge of different tasks. For example, I have a team of 3 particular colleagues who every day are conducting awareness campaigns on do's and don'ts regarding COVID-19 to our branches. But let's stay on the question, and I think I agree with Emily. The primary concerns of our staff right now is, first and foremost, I don't want to get sick, and I'm concerned about my loved ones, and I'm concerned about my family members and relatives in Myanmar. But some of our staff and some of our colleagues, they also have relatives and loved ones working in neighboring countries, and they're concerned about their health since they are not together under the same roof. The second part is obviously the job security and the salary. Do I get paid? Will I get paid? What's happening to my incentive schemes, for example? And third is the collection aspects, the cash aspects, which is a concern that employees have, especially when it comes to are we going to be able to do our job effectively? Are we going to be able to collect money? How can we help our company survive this phase? From our side as employer, obviously, the beginning of the crisis here at the end of March, beginning of April, did not catch us unprepared, but as you guys already said, it's a new global crisis, so there is not a set book of instructions that someone can go and consult. Our priority for Maha right now is collections, is staying afloat, is making sure that there is a Maha after the crisis. Second priority is obviously the continuity of our operations in terms of from a business plan, from a business continuity perspective. It's important that we keep our branches open, we keep serving customers, because even in times of crisis, we microfinance institutions have the important responsibility of serving customers in good and bad times. They might want to withdraw their savings. They might want to avail new products. They might want to talk to us about something, about our rescheduling. So we kept our operations open throughout the month of April with minimal workforce, sort of a skeleton workforce. And we are planning to continue this arrangement until the end of May, but probably that will go even on in June. Last point for me, Leah, is that even in times of crisis, the ability for Maha to continue creating value and generating value should stay there. Every crisis is an opportunity where you learn new things about yourself, about your team, about the environment where you are, and about your own company. And I am extremely grateful to have dear colleagues at board level, at our committees, board committees, management committees, my HR team, and my entire senior management team that is really stepping up to the curve and making sure that we survive this crisis and we ride the wave in a way that after the crisis, we are in a good position to continue creating value for our farming communities in Burma. Thank you, Leah. Over to you guys.
Thanks so much, Matteo. Seth, what would you add?
Yeah, I would obviously echo a lot of what was said, so I'll just try and add in a few things from our perspective. We've got about 10,500 employees across the world, and the vast majority of them are loan officers working in the field, customer-facing roles. So we've got quite a few employees, and I would say from their perspective, to echo what everyone said, it's around job security and the uncertainty and ambiguity that everyone is facing right now is certainly top of mind. Echoing again what the folks said around health and safety. One thing I can say from our perspective that we did right away is that we have, over the past few years, invested heavily in an e-learning platform to be able to deliver trainings to our staff across the world. And so immediately after this hit, we deployed a COVID-19 education training that dispelled some of the myths. And it wasn't something we created; it was third-party content from experts. And so it was a valuable resource for folks on the front line who are dealing with the public that needed to have facts, not rumors. And so that was something we deployed right away, knowing that health and safety was a top concern. I'd add the two more things from the employee perspective, which is they want to know when this will stop, which I think we all want to know. When can we get back to business and get back to what we need to do? They're getting a lot of their own clients coming to them, asking questions about the future and inquiring about being able to get loans in some of the places where we haven't been able to issue loans at the sizes or the lengths of time that people are asking for. So they want to know when we can get back to business. And then the last bit I'll say is about the future. As a business model, we've invested in digitization, digitization of our products, our communication, our services, investing heavily in that. And I think that COVID-19 represents a sea change for the industry, because a lot of the things that we had been focused on building and internally trying to get momentum and enthusiasm around, just by necessity, these things have been, we've seen a giant uptick in them, both in terms of the ways that our customers are communicating with us using branchless channels and the way that they're transacting with us. So I think there's a lot of questions about what does, in our case, Finca, what does Finca Impact Finance look like when we come out of this? Because we know it's going to be different. And I think that's on the minds of our employees. From our perspective, number one concern, obviously, the health and safety of our customers and our staff. Right from the get-go, we instituted with our risk department, took the lead on a coronavirus coordinators group to make sure that leadership was up to date with critical updates from the field, including staff, client illnesses, government regulatory mandates, things like that. But number one, first and foremost, our concern is making sure they are safe and being cared for. Obviously, other concerns are making sure that the organization is ready to serve when the crisis abates, which means that we have been, quite focused on liquidity. That remains a concern. And as I mentioned when I did my introduction, we're having different effects of the virus in different countries, and so different realities in terms of liquidity. Our concern also is making sure that we're very engaged with regulators, and in places where we can, trying to instigate some changes that we think will help in the face of this virus, like things like getting digital signatures and mobile fees and things like that, getting those mitigated. And so engaging with the regulators and with our boards are a top priority. And then I'll just end that. I know we're going to go into it in a second, but obviously our focus is communication, making sure that we are keeping the lines of communication open and active throughout the entire process. I know we're going to get to that in a second. That's what I would summarize as both the employee and employer key concerns right now.
Great. Thanks, Seth, and Matteo and Emily. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into that. But before we continue with the interview, I'd like to ask the audience to put into the chat box, as an employer, what concerns do you have about your workforce? In particular, if there was something that you didn't hear our speaker say, or there's something that you really want to emphasize that you did hear, concerns that you're having about your workforce right now. And that would just help us, it'd be helpful for the Sppf to know what's on your mind, and then even for our speakers who might try to address some of the themes that you put forward. While that's happening, let's continue the discussion. We heard a little bit from Seth already on what Finca Impact Finance is doing to keep employees safe right now. Let's hear from Matteo and Emily. This is of particular importance for institutions who still have branch offices open or agent locations open and functioning, meaning some of the employees are still interacting with clients in person. And I know that Maha is in that position. But Emily, let's start with you. Could you describe what the ILO is working on in this area, particularly with regards to the various employee protection guidelines and the checklist that the ILO has issued?
Yes. I won't go into too much in detail because otherwise you guys will all log off because it will be too much for you. But as Leah mentioned, I've sent some resources to her. We have some very interesting tools that we've developed that can help support you as managers in trying to set up a good safety and health system. So there, as Leah mentioned, there are two parts. I guess Matteo was mentioning that Myanmar isn't in, it's on partial lockdown, but it's not on complete lockdown. I can tell you in Switzerland, you can go to the grocery store and walk back and forth a little bit, but we're not allowed, and there's no difference between day and night. It's the same all the time. If you're not supposed to be out, you shouldn't be out. So for those of you dealing with situations where the country is in lockdown, just some key points that you are still, as employers, in principle, responsible for the safety and health of your workers, even when they're not working on site, but at home. And that means that there are some key steps that you should bear in mind, some key points. So first of all, have a policy that deals with working from home, working remotely where you're not, workers are not particularly closely supervised, and there's a different set of issues that comes out. So having a policy which sets out expectations concerning work hours, confidentiality, safety and safety work practices while at home, that you have a policy and that it's reviewed with the workers and agreed on, because even if you have something on paper, interpretations may differ. So it's important to have a clear understanding. And if there isn't a policy, now's the time to discuss one with your, in dialogue with the workers so that there's strong buy-in. But make sure that you provide support to workers. I know budgets are limited, and it's not as if you have the luxury of transforming everyone's house into an ideal workspace. But still virtually walking your staff through a checklist of safety and health considerations, such as ambient factors about noise and lighting, adequate lighting and so forth, electrical cords well placed and safely put away, safety exits, fire extinguishers, etc. You may take it as a given, well, haven't they done this in their home? But I confess I've never thought about this in my home the way I really should have as a homeowner, but don't take it for granted that they already know these things and do these things when it could be just a short conversation virtually with them to make sure that everything is in check. Provide appropriate equipment as needed, if possible. I know, again, some of you are on very tight budgets and it's not necessarily possible to provide another computer, etc. But to the extent you can and the equipment is needed for them. Assess potential risks and listen for feedback and be supportive if people come with requests, again, bearing in mind the limitations that you are facing. I need to spend a fair amount of time around stress, even though you might not think it's directly related to safety and health. It's really integral, partly because there's a lot of links between physical safety and the stress that people are feeling that can put that in jeopardy. So as Seth was saying, be a reliable source of information, because there's just a lot of anxiety and uncertainty and people need reassurance. You don't have to bombard them every day with an update, but just checking in with them and making sure that they know that you are on top of the most reliable information, which may even mean double checking the sources, but they need to feel like you're sort of their anchor at the moment. And because there's a lot of conspiracy theories, myths, legends, sort of things going on right now, and a lot of confusion that's feeding that anxiety. Compensate for lack of face-to-face communications. This goes to not only the psyche of the workers who kind of take for granted collegial interaction in the workplace that is now gone and is only there virtually, but also realizing that a lot of communication is not verbal, and a lot of those cues, visual cues, feelings that you get talking to someone in person get crunched or lost. So having much clearer expectations on work assignments, targets, deadlines, helping them to clearly prioritize so things aren't taken for granted will help also reduce their stress levels. But also talking with your management to ensure that they have adjusted their expectations concerning workers' delivery rates during lockdowns, and that and especially because of the family, everything is being done at once, that your workplace is the home place, is the everything place right now. which also means that they need to be flexible. There's a tendency for a lot of managers to want to know exactly what their workers are doing at all times. This is where the concept, I don't know if you've heard of time sovereignty, where you give them clear instructions, what they need to do, when they need to get it done by, and then you give them the space to manage that around all their other constraints that they're juggling at the moment. That will empower them and make their stress levels go down, but also at the same time, the productivity will be up because that stress will be down. But I know for some managers, that's a little bit of a leap of faith, and they are still set in a 8 to 6 or 9 to 5, or whatever your hours are, and they expect their workers to be working and available at those times all the time. And they need to kind of relax that concept if that's what's going on with some of your management staff. But also to be more broadly aware, pay attention to risk factors related to isolation. If you get a sense on a Zoom call or something that some of your colleagues are feeling a little depressed or just out of sorts, or maybe need a little bit more space and time or flexibility, you know, maybe having one-on-one side conversations with them, but also encouraging them to get in touch with each other so they don't feel lonely. The other issue I need to mention for people working at home is the increased risk of domestic violence. You've probably already come across it, but it's a real phenomenon as people are under stress, but they also spend 24/7 together, especially in small quarters. Things can get really heated. So the challenge here with domestic violence is that you, at the one hand, need to respect the privacy of your individual staff members and not be too intrusive, too questioning, or too curious, but at the same time, giving them knowledge and resources to empower themselves, and contact information of independent organizations that they can feel confident that they're confidential and trustworthy, that can help them with the psychological support that they need, especially because there's likely no space to leave those dangerous situations right now. As far as safety measures for people who are either staying on the job, the way Matteo had described his staff, at least in shifts, 28-day shifts, or when the economy reopens, you know, clear basic issues around providing masks and ensuring physical distancing between staff, staggering presence is great. I guess the way Matteo was describing on 28-hour-day shifts, or even just within a week, maybe 2 days on, 2 days working from home, however ends up working for your staff, but maybe reducing the density of the staff on site, providing adequate facilities, soaps, sanitizer, et cetera, and just really reinforcing that culture of actually getting the staff to use them, and disinfecting the whole work site regularly, and having good ventilation. There's a lot of stuff coming out more recently about even just microclimates within the same open space, where air circulating in one part of the room is much more conducive to spreading the virus than in others. So making sure that there's excellent ventilation in your spaces, especially if they're open work spaces, to avoid those unintended transmission of infections. But the other key thing to stress, especially with a lot of your staff that are going off-site to go out to their client base, the challenges around limiting or banning non-essential work travel, especially if it involves having the staff travel on crowded public transport, will be really important. The creative ways you've come up with having continued client contact virtually, keep that up as much as possible. And I don't want to take up too much time, but just and make sure that you're really there for them when they have questions and concerns. They may be excited to go back and suddenly have a change of heart and want to work from home. To the extent when you open up again, to have that flexibility is really important, not only for their psychological health, but for maybe their intuition is correct, that they maybe aren't in the best shape. And if they have any kind of symptoms at all that are flu-like, please be proactive in encouraging them to take the time they need to recover at home and not infect anyone else. Just a couple of other things to flag. Remember that you are also likely the very important source of social protection benefits in case they do fall ill. So be prepared to be able to support them around any resources that the government provides, or because of general support right now for the population, or because of entitlements, because they've been contributing to Social Security, medical benefits, sickness benefits, workers' compensation benefits, because in many cases they've expanded workers' comp to include contraction of COVID, and in case of death, survivors' benefits for the family. And just one last thing, again, respecting workers' privacy, there will be perhaps challenges around taking workers' temperatures. If the government has authorized that, that's fine, but otherwise it needs to be with the consent of the workers, and you need to bear that in mind. But also be prepared for discrimination issues that arise if people, especially if you're working with a mixture of workers that have include migrant workers or workers from communities that are considered hotspots, current hotspots for COVID-19, and there might be a lot of anxiety or fear around interacting with people, or just simply anger and hostility being vented on those people. So you also need to pay a bit of attention to discrimination, harassment, and bullying related to COVID-19 health status. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. The discrimination piece is actually not something I've heard talked about very widely. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And if people want to talk about that more, we can pick it up in the Q&A. I also wanted to emphasize what you said about being a trusted source of information as an employer. When I first started talking to financial institutions when COVID was really starting to pick up, and I was talking to them about what they're doing for their employees and their clients, it struck me how many of them had taken on the role of providing health-related information, even though they're not healthcare organizations. And, living in the United States, I would never expect my bank to be my primary source of factual information about my health, nor my employer. I have ways to get that information, but that is not the reality in a lot of countries. And so this role of being a trusted source of factual information is so important. And not to steal Matteo's anecdote, but he was telling me the other day that, a lot of his employees are young and they live in rural areas, since Maha is an Aglander, and they get a lot of their information off of Facebook and social media. And as you mentioned, Emily, there's a lot of rumors and inaccurate health information that is circulating. So it's perfectly appropriate for microfinance institutions to be playing this role of disseminating health information. Great, thank you so much for that. Matteo, and let me mention that I've listed these resources here on the slide. You don't need to copy those down. They're going to be available along with the PowerPoint from today and today's recording on SPTF's COVID-19 page on our website. So I will have these documents, and the links to all of these documents on that page. Okay, Matteo, would you like to tell us what you're doing at Maha to keep employees safe? And I'll kind of flip through some of these great pictures that you sent while you're talking.
Sure, Leah, thank you. First and foremost, at the beginning of the crisis, it was important for us to organize our team, especially our senior management team, in a way that we were being able to function from our respective homes in and around Yangon and Burma, Myanmar. And I think what we realized as a first obstacle was that two issues. One was the availability of a good internet connection back home. Not everybody had fiber, not everybody had a good connectivity, not everybody was in the area where the provider is able to give you good internet. So we purchased, if I'm not mistaken, over 50 small portable Wi-Fi modems. We have distributed to every single head office employee with unlimited data packages in it. So they are absolutely working okay with those devices for whatever it takes, and for the next definitely few weeks. The second step was, just to give you an example, one of our colleagues in Myanmar, it's quite common to have electricity breakdowns and power cuts. Unfortunately, we are not a very well electrified country yet. We are working on it. The government definitely is. And one of the issues is that some of our colleagues are in locations where there are more power cuts than other regions, than other townships, as we say here. And we looked at the possibility of renting or buying small generators in order to power the household of our colleagues. In the end, that was not necessary, but should the need arise, we would be ready to buy additional small portable generators so that the team is able to obviously charge their laptop, their computers, their phones, and any other household appliances. Another third point, which I think was quite effective, and I hope it would be useful for the audience listening in, is that Myanmar is a huge country. There are a lot of states, divisions, and April is an important month for Myanmar. Why? Because we have the Burmese New Year and the Water Festival, which is a beautiful, typical Buddhist celebration that happens pretty much every year during the month of April. And what happens is that it's a 10-day period. Most of the people will fly from overseas back to Myanmar. A lot of Burmese citizens would leave major cities and go back to rural areas. It's an opportunity to go back and spend quality time with loved ones and family. And when the crisis was about to start in Myanmar, we thought at Maha that the reaction of our reaction of sending our people back home would be an important one, and we should be quite fast in taking decisions. In fact, we decided to allow anybody from our head office who wanted to go back to their families to leave immediately, considering that bus stations were still not crowded, in order to avoid these big aggregations of people during the peak of the holiday season. And that was, I think, something that I'm very proud as an organization that we have done, because some of our, for example, female colleagues are working with us in Maha and Yangon, but they live alone in apartments in different locations around town. And having them going back to their families, parents, uncles, aunties, or just relatives in a safer environment, it means a lot to us, it means a lot to them, and I think personally it will help on their productivity, because they don't have to worry about who's going to cook me my breakfast, my lunch, my dinner. There is my auntie looking after me, and they just brought along their portable modem device. Few more points. We have so once we have stabilized the senior management team of our head office, and the business continuity plan was activated, we obviously thought of the branches and the safe and health of our customers and employees. We had purchased massive stocks of face masks, medical gloves, and those temperature gun sort of devices. We had printed 35,000 pamphlets. We had printed new standees with do's and don'ts. And we had distributed all of this protective equipment to all our branches before the crisis started. That was pretty much at the end of March. After the material was disbursed, was sent throughout the country, we had to organize conference calls with our team, explaining them now how to use a mask. Obviously, wearing gloves is pretty easy, how to use those devices, and put in place new protocols for our customers coming in, coming out, and being served. We are very lucky because we've been working with Microsoft, and Maha is a subscriber of O365. So we're using Microsoft Teams during the crisis in order to maintain a direct, constant touch with our branches, with our regional offices, and with our head office colleagues. And we obviously having several daily calls. I keep a habit of having a morning daily call with all my senior management team. I'm sure by now they're absolutely tired of listening of my voice and seeing my ugly face every morning. I'm sorry, team, if you're listening. But I think it's an opportunity for us to talk about the achievements of the day before, talk about the priorities for the day or for the week, and any support or help that particular employee might need. And we also touch base on questions such as, are you okay? Do you have any symptoms? Are your family members okay? Do you need any support from Maha or our parent company? If so, do let us know. Another factor, here you will see the photo of our branch manager taking the temperature of one of our colleagues. We are asking every single colleague and every single customer of Maha to wash hands before they start working and before they enter the branch. Typically in the past, dear Leah and dear audience, we were having over 50 to 60 customers at any given time in our branches. In cooperation with local authorities and the Ministry of Health here in Burma, we have decided to only accommodate up to 5 farmers, between 5 and 10 to be precise, at any given time. And we have implemented since day one very strict social distancing measures between employees and between our employees and our customers. As you can see from this photo, we had to install also those wash stations / basins outside of each of our branches with soap and a hand sanitizer, so that people would be able to wash their hands before they come into one of our branches. The other couple of other points that I'd like to share to the audience, to the people listening to us, is the fact that I think giving clear instructions when the way you're conducting business is new is of fundamental importance. Being present with the daily calls and assigning daily calls to different team members, it's also an important element that I would like to recommend to a lot of institutions out there. It's not important that the CEO has those calls, but it's important that a lot of people are involved in making different calls based on different needs. And obviously, sometimes it's also important, as Emily was saying, to have just a chat about how are you doing, are you having a bad day, so what can I do to make it better? I think there is a lot of stress, and there are definitely a lot of uncertainties. And sometimes even a simple call, which is not work-related, but in our head office, at least a few weeks ago, we were sharing photos of what we're cooking. It lightens the mood. It helps put a bit of perspective to a very stressful crisis situation. And well, we are realizing that in-house at Maha, we have a bunch of potential master chef candidates, which makes me extremely happy, although it's not our core business. But I would like to pause here because I'm sure Seth would like to add something. Otherwise, we end up saying everything right now. Leah, back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Matteo. So my question to Seth actually is around communication. So Matteo just told us, the importance that he feels of giving clear instructions and having daily calls. And I feel like Finca Impact Finance, is doing this so well. So could you tell us, Seth, about your communication strategies with him?
Sure, absolutely. So I think I mentioned in the beginning, we have 20 different countries, 10,000 staff, 2.5 million customers, and 10 different time zones. So the virus is affecting everyone differently in each of those countries. And so our communication has been that while everyone is not yet in the same boat, we're all facing the same storm. So I've organized the way we have done internal communication into 3 different buckets. The first one was the speed that we had to respond. We formed a crisis communication group literally the first week when we started doing our work from home back in March. And the point of that was to coordinate messaging and align on priorities and to establish a cadence of communication, because one of the things we knew was going to happen is that it was going to come fast and furious, and if we didn't have it organized well, things would get lost, things would get missed. So streamlining communications early on, that was critical. From a technology perspective, we actually had to make a bunch of shifts because we didn't even have the capability to have 2,000 plus web calls. We had done all staff calls many, many times, but in those cases, our staff in the subsidiaries would go to one room and they'd have one login to hear our global CEO or COO speak. And now with so many of our staff remote, we were faced with this challenge of thousands of people. So we use Teams and Skype for Business. And so we immediately switched to live events, which had a few challenges in terms of being able to chat. But because we were suddenly faced with 1,000 people on a call as opposed to 200, we had to move quickly. Another thing that we made sure of with our communication group is that it didn't all fall on our CEO's hand. It didn't fall on the comms people's hand. Everybody was a communicator. Everyone had to speak to the same points. So people heard it from all of the leaders. And obviously, it's not a lot. You can't just ask your CEO to carry the message. So we made sure that any communication guidance was sent to the entire management team of every subsidiary as well as headquarters, because everybody needed to be singing from the same book. The second bucket I want to talk about is that it was multi-channel. Multi-channel and many channels. So our first principle was don't go silent, communicate, communicate, communicate. So we started sending out messages every single day, but email doesn't cut it. Emails get lost, especially when you have 150 right before you wake up. So we started exploring other ideas. We had been playing around with internal podcasts. And so we stuck with that as the second form of communication, because audio podcasts, they're not too big to email because they're pretty small. We could record them from the safety of your own home. And so we did some audio update podcasts from our CEO and sent those out. We also did a lot of calls and different level of calls. So we would have all staff calls, then we would have leadership calls, communication calls, and try to get to everybody in different ways, not just shooting off emails saying, here's what's happening, here's what you need to do. And then I'd say the last thing is consistency. I mentioned in the beginning, we did a lot with regulator engagement. We obviously had to do loan restructuring at scale at a level we have never done before. But luckily, we were able to pull on some of our subsidiaries that had encountered crisis in the past to come up with guidance. But we issued a series of guidance documents on things like customer engagement, proactive customer engagement, regulator engagement, loan restructuring, so that everybody knew the strategy and how to proceed. You know, these weren't like very, very specific, do this, then this, then this. This gave the general direction of what they needed to do so that everybody was rowing in the same direction. It was our key principles, and it allowed us to put forth what the subsidiary should be doing and have them take it and run with it, sort of a freedom within a framework approach. We created an intranet hub where all of our documents were kept and maintained, so no one had to rely on those conference calls or emails. We had already had one using SharePoint, and so we started putting every document there so that no one had to worry that they missed anything. And then we changed our business as usual. We do things like, we call it the Finca Flash. It's an internal newsletter which highlights, you know, different innovations in products and channels and things like that. And we immediately shifted it so that it started sharing some of the best practices of the subs and what they were doing, and sharing some images and graphics that they were using on social media and things like that. I'll wrap up by saying that, you know, because I know for time, the challenge moving forward that we're facing and thinking about. I mentioned that we're seeing a lot of change, both at how our customers talk to us, how they want to transact with us. And I think the key challenge that we're facing now is, how do you capture that? How do you build on that on the changes that are already happening when everybody is moving so quickly and everybody is dealing with the moment right now? And so
the one thing we're really trying to do is capture a lot of that. So when I'm talking about the changes, we had invested a lot in digital marketing, in using our website so that clients can understand our products and begin the application process. We're seeing giant upticks in our web traffic, our social media traffic, our inbound WhatsApp, Viber, all of those, so Facebook in particular. And we're seeing so much of that. And so we are making sure we put some time aside to document what's happening, to make sure that as we come out of this, and we will one day come out of this, I'm sure of it, I say it for myself and for everybody else, but that as we come out of it, our long-term business transformation is something that we can progress, and striking a balance between dealing with the moment right now, but also thinking through, how when we come out of this, that we are a changed organization that's better meeting the needs of our customers.
Thanks so much, Seth. I think that each of you has pointed out this need to already be thinking about, that some of these changes are going to be permanent, that our industry is, that COVID-19 and this crisis, the health crisis, and also the economic crisis is going to leave a mark on our industry, far beyond this year. And that we can already start thinking about how to do things differently, even once the worst of the crisis has abated. And I think that's a wonderful mindset, both for mental health reasons, but also for business reasons as well. So thank you so much for that. So I have one more substantive question, and already some questions are coming in from the audience, which is fantastic. So please do keep those coming, and we'll go back to those here in just a few minutes when we start the Q&A. But I'd like to touch briefly on, a tricky topic, but one that's very practical and probably on everyone's mind. And that is, what are some of the alternatives to retrenchment or letting employees go, particularly in the event of a cash crisis? So in other words, how are financial institutions supposed to balance the need to keep their workforce employed with the need to conserve cash, especially because we don't know what the full effects of the crisis are. So I'd like to put this to Emily and Matteo, and maybe Emily, could you start with your ideas?
Sure. I actually wrote the ILO's brief on responsible restructuring in crisis, and that has a whole section on trying to preserve jobs. I'll just hit on some of the highlights that are particularly relevant for MFIs, but I think I sent that to Leah, but Leah, if I didn't, let me know and I'll send you the link to more detailed sort of action plans for employers. So the first objective is to preserve jobs. And I think some of the things that, from my perspective as someone who's an economist that also works on macroeconomic employment policies, we have another brief on that. And on that brief, it's called, I don't know what it's called, but I'll send the link to Leah as well. But Yusra, who is another colleague who works on social finance, she made sure that there was a strong presence for microfinance institutions because we wanted to firmly put on the radar of policymakers trying to deal with the short and long-term fallout of COVID-19 on the labor market and the capital market, that MFIs are going to be an extremely important intermediary. Do not think just about big banks as a way of injecting liquidity, but also think of MFIs. So one of the things we were speaking about in that is for policymakers to think of MFIs as ways of channeling relief funding, both loans and grants, because you also need institutions to distribute grants, and to the extent that governments are able to afford to give money to businesses that otherwise would not be able to take on loans. That's important. But also use MFIs as conduits for information on government policies and programs impacting clients, especially because MFIs, not all of you, but many of you, play an important bridging role to the informal sector, and especially when an economy is composed of 50, 60, 80% informal economy operators. That's really critical to get a handle on how much COVID has impacted the economy, and MFIs can be an important financial information source. In other words, governments are thinking more expansively about MFIs. And so what I would encourage you as MFIs to do is download that document, that policy brief, either go to your representative body of microfinance institutions, or just if you're big enough, and it sounds like some of you, such as Matteo's organization, are big enough that you can go and maybe lobby the government directly to help the government see you in a very large picture capacity. And that's partly to help you come out stronger in the end, but in the meantime, also bring in cash, because you would also be compensated for the services that you're doing for the government. That will give you an injection of funds that can keep you operational without having to lose any of your staff, or a minimum of staff. But there's also other strategies if those efforts fail, or if there just isn't enough government resources to actually, they might say, yes, go and do that, but we don't have the money to pay you, which is not particularly helpful. But the things that you can do otherwise are the typical things: job sharing, reduced hours of work, trying to tap into any government programs where they may be subsidizing salaries that you can apply to become part of, or hybrid training opportunities that the government is offering as a way of paid trainings that are trying to inject cash into the economy at the same time. See if your workers can tap into any of those sorts of offerings by the government, or other resources. Many of you may be financial institutions linked to big development financial institutions who may have grants available from their home country parent organizations that you may want to discuss with them how you can get a temporary increase in credit and so forth. But in the worst case, try, and if you have to let go of workers, and if their job status is what's linking them to many critical benefits like health care, try and explore as many options such as furloughs, where they lose their salary and they don't work, but they don't lose their benefits because they're still technically an employee. Those sorts of arrangements that keep a sort of tie that enables them to have any sort of benefits that you can possibly still afford, especially if they're public benefits that aren't a severe cash drain on the operations of the MFI. But as I said, we have actually, I think it's a 10-page restructuring brief that walks you through these things in great detail. The one thing I just would like to stress with you is the importance of dialogue all through the process. Your workers will understand the stress you're going through, and it sounds like, especially with the two examples of Matteo and Sppf, and the thought that they've given into so many different aspects of the lives of their workers. If your other MFIs of you out there are even remotely linked to that, you're really above the basic benchmark of many companies' operations and having a deep commitment to your workers. So there will already be a good reservoir of goodwill and trust in your judgment, and understanding that firing people or laying them off temporarily will be a last resort. But nonetheless, having these ongoing dialogues, as much transparency as possible, will help keep their spirits up even when they're feeling really low, thinking, okay, we're going to get through this together, and this pain has been spread as equitably and as fairly as possible and so forth. That will give them more confidence in the whole process. To the extent that they're organized, or even if they aren't organized, being able to talk through maybe a representative that they've chosen themselves, because one of the complexities in restructuring or avoiding restructuring and having things like wage cuts or reduced hours of work that in both ways are reducing their incomes that may already be fairly lean. It's important that they be able to have a channel of communication, but sometimes it's difficult for them to raise these issues individually. So having some workers' representatives that they feel confident who can take their collective concerns could also help in building in a stronger faith and trust in that system when you're, as management, are making these difficult decisions. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Emily. And one thing you said about trying to influence government policy, it reminded me of a way that Sppf, the Small Enterprise Foundation in South Africa, is repurposing its staff rather than laying their staff off. They're repurposing their staff to gather information for the government, and so that it can influence the way their clients' businesses are treated. And I think we have John DeWitt on the call. And so, John, just to give you a heads up, I might call on you in a few minutes to tell us about that, because I think that it's a great example of how some institutions are using their existing staff who cannot work in the field right now or cannot do their typical jobs, repurposing them to client communication. So that's a heads up for you, John. So I want to now get into Q&A. First, Matteo, I wanted to give you maybe a minute, if that's all right. If there's anything that you wanted to add to this question of alternatives to retrenchment, because I know last time we talked, Maha had not laid off any employees, and so could you spend 60
Sure,
seconds?
absolutely. Allow me maybe 60 seconds and 30 seconds more, but anyway. So I think I was reading some of the questions that the audience was adding on the chat, and I think one of the points raised by some of our colleagues was, how can we make sure that our institution stays afloat, and how can we make sure that our institution is able to pay salaries? What we have done at Maha at the beginning of the crisis, again, over a month ago, was to decide, first of all, to take certain assumptions. We decided that April, May, and June were going to be the crisis months. Hence, we have decided to only pay salaries, only pay the rentals, only pay the interest and principal obligations to our lenders, and any crucial IT-related, core banking-related payment in order to maintain, again, a continuity of our operations. Any training, hiring, non-essential expense has been deferred to July, assuming July would become the BAU, business as usual month. I think that was a very important first step that we took at Maha. The other important first step was to be extremely transparent with our communication and mentioning to our team good news as well as bad news in a very open, transparent, timely manner. And I think the team, at least based on my perception here, is able to appreciate, understand a lot more what's happening just between myself, our senior management team, myself and the board. My team is able to be exposed to our different board committees and management committees. So as Seth was saying before, everybody's a communicator, and we take that role quite seriously. The other important aspect that I would like to pass on to our colleagues on the call and to the audience is involve the board, involve the management involve management committees, people, involve board committees, colleagues, involve your chairman. Make sure that there is, from top down, a clear communication and everybody knows the good and the bad. Another important aspect is being considered by the government as a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. That's why social distancing, following government directives is extremely important. For example, Maha is an agriculture of FI. We typically collect loans which are bullet in nature. So we have massive repayments during certain days, but we don't have any weekly, fortnightly, monthly, for example, type of repayments. And our collections, again, we employ 100% individual lending methodology. So you might want to also check with the regulator and perhaps adjust your collection methods during crisis times. As Ilya said, and I'm sorry for my delay over the 60 seconds, we have decided that Maha not to lay off any staff, but to weather the crisis together. What we have done at the end of March, we also paid 2 months advance salary to all our employees to make sure that they were able to cope with the crisis, perhaps stock up some food, buy some household essential items, and now we are discussing with the board and our remuneration nomination committee what's the plan to recoup this money back in the coming 6 months. Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Matteo. Thank you very much. And, on this topic of figuring out how to protect jobs, I do want to mention briefly a new guide that was just released by the CDC group. It's called COVID-19 Guidance for Investors and Financial Institutions on Job Protection. And I am putting that into the chat box, the link there. And it's just a really useful document that guides financial institutions and investors through the workforce-related discussions and decisions that need to be made during COVID-19 planning. So check that out. I think you'll find it useful. Great. So we already have a lot of good questions coming in. So I would like to raise some of those. So we had a question about how to handle physical cash safely. And I believe Laura put into the chat box some great pointers that came out of MicroSave PowerPoint, MSc Consulting PowerPoint, and has the link there. So we won't add anything to that because I believe that content is there. Charlotte asked, in places where containment is declared and remote working is recommended, how do staff manage to keep in touch with clients and recover delays? And HP from Ethiopia mentioned in response to that question, I believe, that where there is, in Ethiopia, there's not a lockdown, but they can't meet and they're not supposed to travel. So they are contacting group leaders by phone, and they send cash to the group leader, and the group leader or group's members take turn collecting, and then the staff picks it up from an agreed on place and gives the receipt for payment, comes back to the office on foot or on motorbike. So using the group leaders that are already in those communities to do some of that work, so that I believe that so that the loan officer isn't making contact with, let's say, 5, 10, 20 different people, but just one. How can you come up with a uniform or similar communication matter and agenda with staff during physical distancing? Anyone with some practical tips and actions that they used? Great. So, Seth, do you want to take a stab at this, and do we need extra clarification from HP on what that question means?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was actually going to just speak to the one before. So the question before was about how do we maintain our customer communication when we can't see them? Was that the question that was just before?
Yes, I believe so. That has been, yeah.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to speak very quickly about that because that's a big part of what we're doing right now. And so we've issued one of those guidance documents I mentioned about proactive customer communication in the face of not being face-to-face. And we're doing a lot on this. We're doing a lot of SMSing and a lot of investment in our call center. We have call centers in all of our subsidiaries that had been collections call centers and in some cases inbound. And we've reallocated staff to proactive customer education and communication. So we've done a lot in terms of our call centers. We're using web chat
We're using digital forms on our website. I mentioned the call center, and a lot on Facebook in terms of messaging. Just to throw a little bit of stats at you, I looked at February versus March at those different channels because, like I mentioned, we're seeing such a big uptick. And in Jordan, where they were in complete lockdown, we had a 58% increase in inbound calls. In Kosovo, which also had a curfew, we started implementing web chat where people can come to our website and just talk to us through a chat there. We had a 2,000% increase in that. In Ecuador, which you might have read, has been devastated, especially in Guayaquil. Ecuador is really feeling the brunt of COVID-19 right now in a heartbreaking way. We have a 185% increase in Facebook Messenger. I've spent the last year working with the marketing managers of Finca Impact Finance to try and build and grow our digital channels for communication and marketing to varying degrees of success and challenge. But what's happening right now is simply unprecedented as our customers, because of necessity, are reaching out to us in any which way they can. So that's just to address the question right before.
That's great, and I think you bring up a great point that a few people are making in the chat box. And you know, we heard from Alia early on in the chat that Al Majmua has a call center, and not only for clients but also for employees. And then Francis has mentioned that at MCRIL they're seeing that having a short list of key FAQs, both for the staff and the clients, can be really helpful. Great. Alia, would you like to say something? You have your hand raised and you've given us a lot of great things to think about in the chat. Laura, could you unmute Alia? Okay, Alia, you're unmuted if you'd like to add something here.
Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you very much for organizing this very interesting webinar. And basically, it was just to highlight that indeed talking about the expanding role of HR in such a crisis is really key, and we've been observing it on a daily basis at the Majmua. And one of the things that actually we're trying to do now is to gather all of the initiatives that we've been doing related to our staff during the crisis, so that we would be able to also share some of those lessons with you. So probably the thing that we'll do will be to share with SPTF this small case study on it. And I think that what we learned mainly from this crisis is really communication and the ability to remain close to the staff as much as we're trying to remain close to our clients. And this is an important thing, because once the crisis will ended, our human capital will be key in getting back on our feet. So basically that's it. Over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alia. Okay, I mentioned that I'd love to hear from John about how he is using staff to collect information from small businesses and then pass that on to the government. John, would you mind sharing for a few minutes about what Sppf is doing?
Sure, Leo. Actually, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Yes, so we're an MFI based in South Africa, and South Africa had its first case of COVID in early March, and then declared full lockdown. I think it was 26th of March. Now our lockdown, which actually was the 5-week lockdown, was quite a severe one. You simply had to stay at home. You could go out to buy groceries. You could go out to access financial services or go to pharmacy or doctor, but you couldn't go out for a run. You couldn't go out for a walk. So they tried to have quite a strict lockdown, which the entire population is very, very grateful for. So what we decided to do was to allow our staff to go on lockdown as well. We are, as a financial service, we are regarded as an essential service. So our staff could have asked our staff to continue working, but in a kind of innocence, I think we thought that, you go go through the lockdown and then things will return to some normality. So we said, okay, fine, everybody go home, be in lockdown. Our staff were in lockdown, they were using mobile phones to communicate with their clients and keep in contact with clients. Then we had, of course, this real challenge of knowing, well, what is happening to clients and what is happening to clients' businesses in this time? Because, with the lockdown, presumably a lot of informal businesses simply couldn't operate. So we got some of the staff, we had a team of social survey officers. So in normal times, their job, and there are 6 of them, their job is to go out and interview clients. So randomly go to a branch, randomly find clients and talk to them. Discuss with things like their client satisfaction, so do a client satisfaction survey with them, then understand how their businesses are going. So we got that group of people, and then also some of our quality and compliance people who were available. Actually, not quality and compliance, some of our call center people. And we put those 2 groups on and said, right, please start phoning as many clients as possible. And there was a list of questions that they would work through. And the aim of this was to try and understand what's happening in clients' lives right now. Are they able to continue their businesses? And if not, what is their source of income for the household? What's their estimate of, when is the money in the household going to run out? 2 weeks, a month's time, longer than that, and various questions. As we were asking these questions, so we were doing it for our own purposes, but then we began to see that there were real regulation or policy issues coming up. So, for example, people who are running small, tiny little grocery stores. In a grocery store, we just got one room of the house with a few groceries in it. Those kind of stores. They were allowed to operate as long as they got a permit. But we were finding people very often couldn't get the permit, either because they would go to get the permit and police would turn them back and allow them to go into town to get the permit, or you had to go quite a long way to get the permit. So there's one example of there was a regulation, there was a way in which people could operate, but they couldn't get through some hurdles to actually access that permit. So then we were able to use that information, that kind of information, feed it through our network to people who were in touch with the government. And then you would hear that in the government discussions, or you would hear that it's not very openly, but more like on the ground, you would hear of changes happening. Another example was at one point the government actually came to our network and said, we are looking to perhaps open up the hairdressing business and allow hairdressers to operate. How many hairdressers are you working with? So we could then feed back to them and say, yes, we're working with lots of hairdressers, but the challenge for the hairdressers is going to be as soon as their current stock of products has run out, they can't restock. And so we could feed that back to government. So what began as a project for our own information also led to us bumping into policy-related things, and then fortunately through our network, we could feed some of that through to government. And I have to, by the way, I have to give huge praise to our government. They have been extremely open-minded, extremely wanting to understand what is happening to the most vulnerable members of our society and trying to come up with strategies to protect the most vulnerable.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for that input. Really appreciate that. Okay, so we are just about out of time. But I thought we could end on a positive note, and I would like to ask each of our speakers to tell us maybe 1 or 2 things that you're seeing that are helping to keep staff morale high right now. Could we start with Matteo?
Thank you, Leah. So what's in our case, what's really helping Lighten the mood is having daily one-on-one chats between reporting line managers and subordinates, touching base on their well-being. We are conducting those calls. I'm sorry for those unhappy faces as per Leah's message, but I guess we were discussing something seriously during that time. We're also typically every couple of months we conduct physical town hall meetings. But in those extraordinary circumstances, we are now moving all those town hall meetings with the entirety of our workforce to a virtual online platform. And we are conducting those virtual town hall meetings on a fortnightly basis, every second week. As Seth mentioned, also Maha has been sending SMSs to a lot of our customers and organizing campaigns ad hoc, for example, when it comes to repayments. An important aspect also for us is, again, sharing anecdotes about each other's families, who is cooking better, whether someone has been having a haircut. For example, a lot of our spouses and partners have been having haircuts at home. My wife did a great job according to her, not so much according to me, and that was a cause of some laughter during those challenging times. I think anything that can lighten up the mood, especially from managers to the team, goes a long, long way. I'd like to close by thanking you, Laura, Leah, for having me and Maha on this webinar. Stay safe, everybody, and look after yourself, your employees, and your customers. Thank you on behalf of Maha. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Matteo. Seth, what are you seeing among your affiliates and even among the management for helping keep staff morale high?
I mean, it's the little things. I just have to echo. I'll give two really sweet examples. The first, we had our COO runs a CEO call for all the CEOs of the network, and the CEO of Armenia was sharing her personal experience, and it was her birthday. She mentioned offhand it was her birthday. And so 50 people went off mute and sang happy birthday in their own language. And it was like, you couldn't understand anything, right? It was just complete chaos, but it was absolutely wonderful. The second thing is, trying to find the bits of the new normal, I would say. We have our global management meeting in March, and we spend months planning it. Obviously, it was canceled. And what we normally do then is we have one Finca staff member, we call her the Finca Star. For him or her, the Finca Star is announced. And wherever they are in their country, we sneak a Skype person in there to show her reaction when she gets it. And everybody from the management, about 100 people stand up and clap. And we couldn't do it this year in the same way we've done it before. So instead, we did an all-staff call and did the same thing where somebody, tricked her into saying, join this call because she couldn't speak English. And so we were able to announce our Finca Global Star, who was Gulchera Karbanova in Tajikistan. And so even though she was just in a branch sitting at her chair, everybody came off mute and clapped. And, she might not have known everybody that was there. And then they took pictures of her as she received it. And it was just sweet. It was obviously different than we normally do it, but it was something that we've been doing as a tradition for 5 years, just in a different way. And those are the things I think that keep people going and can bring a bit of a smile to a face on days that are pretty relentless and stressful.
Those are awesome examples, and kind of giving them a sense of normalcy as well. It's a different channel for that type of communication, but you've always done it and you're still doing it. So I think that's very, very cool. Emily, anything that you would add about keeping staff morale high?
I would just echo what both Matteo and Seth were saying about trying to recreate the human contact that people are missing right now and really craving. We have coffees, you'll have initiatives, reach out to someone you don't necessarily even talk to at the office, but who you might want to have contact with. Just let them know that you're thinking about them. And it is nice to get these emails and have virtual coffees and so forth. Also to be able to vent and talk about stress and so forth. But the other thing I would add is that we keep reminding ourselves of these trying times ahead with what may very well be either another great recession or a depression. globally, and how the work that we do is going to be even more important. And I would just stress so strongly to you all that microfinance institutions will really be on the front line of that very important work. And although it's perhaps a bit depressing to think about, on the other hand, it's so energizing thinking, wow, we are doing something really important. So I would love for you to just remind your staff every day, wow, you guys are doing things that are really, really going to be so pivotal in the lives of so many millions of people now and in the coming few years as we unwind the mess of the economy right now.
Thanks, Emily. And I put myself back on video just so you can see my big smile, because it has really, really been great to have this conversation. Like I said, SPTF is going to continue working on this subject of social responsibility to employees during COVID. So thank you very much, not only to our speakers who did an excellent job of preparing and presenting today, but also to the 50 or so people that we have on the line. Thank you for sharing your questions and your experience. As I mentioned, we are going to have this PowerPoint presentation and recording and related links available on our website. And I'm just going to put it in the box here so you can go back to any of the materials and you can pass this on to any of your colleagues who might have missed today's event. So with that, I will say thank you again, especially to Emily and Seth and Matteo, and I wish you all a great rest of your day. Bye.
Everyone.